What happens when a music legend with decades of experience sits down with a talk show host known for his provocative questions? The answer might surprise you, because what started as a routine interview turned into one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history. Before we get into what went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on after you hear this whole story. The studio lights were blazing hot that evening, and Dionne Warwick walked onto the set with a kind of grace that only comes from 6 decades in the entertainment industry. She wore an elegant cream-colored suit, her signature short hair perfectly styled, and she carried herself with the poise of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone. Cohen stood up from behind his desk, that familiar wide grin plastered across his face, and extended his hand toward the legendary singer. "Miss Warwick, it is such an honor to have you here," Andy said, his voice dripping with enthusiasm as the audience erupted into applause. Dionne took his hand briefly, her expression pleasant but reserved. "Thank you for having me," she replied, her voice steady and controlled as she settled into the guest chair. The audience quieted down, and Andy leaned forward on his desk, his eyes gleaming with that particular energy he always brought to his interviews. "You know, I have to say, you look absolutely incredible. What's the secret? Good genes and minding my business." Dionne answered without missing a beat, and the audience laughed. But there was something in her tone, a slight edge that suggested she wasn't entirely here for small talk. Andy chuckled, clearly enjoying her directness. "Well, I love that. And speaking of minding business, or maybe not minding it, you've become quite the social media sensation these days. Your Twitter account is legendary. Do you actually write all those tweets yourself?" Dionne's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course, I write them myself. Who else would write them?" No, I just meant, a lot of celebrities have people managing their social media, and your tweets are so." He paused, searching for the word, sharp. "They're very sharp." "I say what I mean," Dionne stated flatly. "Is that a problem?" The studio audience murmured, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Andy's smile remained fixed, but his posture changed slightly, leaning back as if reassessing his approach. "Not at all. Not at all. I think it's refreshing, actually. You called out someone recently for mispronouncing your name. That tweet went viral." "People should know how to pronounce someone's name before they speak about them," Dionne said, her voice firm. "It's called respect, something that seems to be in short supply these days." Andy nodded vigorously. "Absolutely, absolutely. And you've never been one to hold back, which I love. In fact, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. You've worked with everyone, Burt Bacharach, Hal David, some of the greatest songwriters of all time. But there were also some, let's say, complicated relationships in the industry. Can you talk about some of the challenges you faced as a woman in the music business back then?" Dionne's expression remained neutral, but her voice took on a cooler tone. "Back then? You say that as if those challenges don't exist now." "Well, sure, of course, they still exist. But," Andy stammered slightly, "things have changed quite a bit, haven't they?" "Have they?" Dionne asked, raising one eyebrow. "Because from where I'm sitting, people are still asking the same tired questions, still trying to get artists to talk about drama instead of their craft, still reducing women to their relationships with men instead of celebrating what they've accomplished on their own." The audience fell completely silent. Andy's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "That's not what I'm trying to do here, Miss Warwick. I'm genuinely interested in your story." "My story," Dionne repeated slowly, "is that I recorded some of the most iconic songs in American music history. I've won multiple Grammys. I've sold over 100 million records worldwide. I've been a United Nations Global Ambassador for the Food and Agriculture Organization. I've raised money for AIDS research when people were afraid to even talk about it. But you want to ask me about complicated relationships?" Andy shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting this level of pushback. "I think our audience would be interested in all aspects of your life, not just the professional accomplishments." "Then ask me about my humanitarian work," Dionne countered. "Ask me about what it was like to use my platform to help people during the AIDS crisis, when so many celebrities stayed silent. Ask me about the schools I've helped fund or the children I've mentored. There's plenty to discuss that doesn't involve gossip." The tension in the studio was palpable now. Andy glanced toward his producers off camera, then back at Dionne. "You're absolutely right, and we'll get to all of that." But I think people also connect with artists on a personal level. And personal is not the same as private, Dionne interrupted. And I've always been very clear about where that line is. Andy took a breath, visibly trying to regain control of the interview. Okay, fair enough. Let's talk about your music then. You're known for these incredible ballads, these love songs that have stood the test of time. Walk on by, I Say a Little Prayer. Do you know the way to San Jose? What was it about Burt Bacharach's compositions that resonated so deeply with you? Dionne's posture relaxed slightly, and for the first time since sitting down, something resembling warmth entered her expression. Burt understood melody in a way that very few composers do. His chord progressions weren't standard, they were sophisticated, complex, and they required a vocalist who could navigate those changes with precision. Hal David's lyrics complemented Burt's music perfectly, creating these complete, emotional landscapes. When I sang their songs, I wasn't just performing, I was inhabiting entire stories. That's beautiful, Andy said, seeming genuinely moved. And when you were recording those songs, did you ever imagine they would become as timeless as they have? I knew they were special, Dionne admitted, but timeless. That's up to the listeners, not the artist. What I knew was that I was being given material that allowed me to showcase my instrument in ways that other songs didn't. Burt wrote specifically for my voice, and that kind of collaboration is rare. Andy leaned forward again, perhaps sensing an opening. And when that collaboration ended, when you and Burt stopped working together, was that difficult for you personally? The warmth evaporated from Dionne's face instantly. We're back to this. I'm just asking about a significant professional relationship, Andy said, his tone defensive now. You're asking in a way that's fishing for drama, Dionne corrected him. Burt and I had a remarkable run together. When it ended, we both moved on to other projects. That's how careers work. Not everything needs to be framed as a tragedy or a scandal, but there were reports, Dionne cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade, written by people who weren't in the room, who didn't know what they were talking about, who were more interested in selling papers than telling the truth. I don't deal in reports. I deal in facts. Andy's face flushed slightly. I'm not trying to upset you, Miss Warwick. Then stop asking questions designed to do exactly that, she replied evenly. The audience was completely still now, everyone watching this exchange with rapt attention. Andy glanced at his notes, clearly trying to find a way to salvage the interview. Let's talk about your recent projects. You've been in the studio again, working on new material. What can you tell us about that? Dionne studied him for a long moment before responding. I'm always working on new material. Music doesn't stop just because you reach a certain age, despite what this industry might want people to believe. No one's suggesting that, Andy protested. Aren't they? Dionne challenged. When was the last time you had someone over 70 on this show talking about their new music? Not reminiscing about the old days, not doing some nostalgia tours, but actually discussing their current creative work. Andy opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly unable to come up with an answer. Exactly, Dionne said quietly. The industry wants to put people like me in a box labeled legend and leave us there. Like we're museum pieces, instead of living, breathing artists who still have something to say. Andy cleared his throat, attempting to recover from that pointed observation. Well, I think that's a really important point you're making, and I want to give you the platform to talk about your new work. So tell us, what's inspiring you musically right now? Dionne settled back in her chair, her shoulders still squared, her gaze unwavering. I'm inspired by the same things that have always inspired me. Love, loss, hope, resilience. The human experience doesn't change just because decades pass. What changes is how we express it, the production styles, the technology we use to capture it. But the core emotions, those are timeless. That's profound, Andy said, nodding. And are you working with any contemporary producers or artists on this new material? I am, Dionne confirmed. There are some incredibly talented people making music today who understand the importance of melody and lyrical substance. Not everything has to be about beats and hooks. Sometimes a song needs to breathe, needs space to let the emotion come through. Andy's eyes lit up, perhaps thinking he'd found safer territory. Speaking of contemporary artists, there's been this whole conversation online about your tweets regarding some of the newer singers. People found it hilarious when you asked if they know the difference between a melody and a hook. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Dionne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I wasn't trying to be hilarious. I was asking a legitimate question, right? But it came across as pretty critical of today's artists, Andy pressed. Leaning forward again with that gleam in his eye that suggested he thought he'd struck gold. Critical, Dionne repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. Or honest. There's a difference, Andy. When I came up in this business, you had to be able to sing, actually sing, not rely on studio, tricks and auto-tune, and producers who could make anyone sound passable. You had to have an instrument, a real voice that could carry a melody, hold a note, convey emotion through your vocal performance alone. But don't you think music evolves? Andy countered. I mean, every generation has its own sound, its own style. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's less valid. Dionne leaned forward now, matching his posture, her eyes locked on his. I didn't say different was less valid. I said that basic musicianship seems to be optional now, and that's a problem. You can evolve without abandoning the fundamentals. You can innovate without throwing away everything that made music great in the first place. But who decides what makes music great? Andy asked, his tone taking on a slightly argumentative edge. Isn't that subjective? Quality is not as subjective as people like to pretend it is, Dionne shot back. There are objective measures of vocal ability, of musicianship, of songwriting craft. You can prefer different styles, sure, but let's not act like everything is equal just because it's popular. The audience murmured, some people nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable. Andy glanced at his producers again, and Dionne caught the look. Are we boring you? She asked pointedly. What? No, not at all, Andy stammered. We're running up against a commercial break. And then take your commercial break, Dionne said coolly. I'll be here. Andy forced a smile and turned to the camera. We'll be right back with more from the legendary Dionne Warwick. Don't go anywhere. The studio lights dimmed slightly, indicating they were off air, and Andy immediately loosened his collar, taking a sip of water from a mug on his desk. Dionne sat perfectly still, her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable. A producer rushed over to Andy, whispering something in his ear. He nodded, then looked over at Dionne. Miss Warwick, I hope you know, I have nothing but respect for you and your work, he said, his voice lower now, more genuine without the cameras rolling. Then show it, Dionne replied simply, not raising her voice, not moving an inch. Show it by asking me questions that reflect that respect. Before Andy could respond, the stage manager called out that they were back in 30 seconds. Andy straightened his jacket, plastered the smile back on his face, and prepared to continue. Dionne remained exactly as she was, a statue of composure and controlled intensity. The lights came back up, and Andy addressed the camera with renewed energy. And we're back with the incomparable Dionne Warwick. Before the break, we were having a really interesting discussion about music and evolution and standards. You mentioned that basic musicianship seems optional now. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? Dionne regarded him carefully, as if trying to determine whether this was a genuine question or another trap. What I mean is that the bar has been lowered. In my day, if you couldn't sing, you didn't get a record deal. Period. You might be beautiful, you might have a great image, but if you couldn't deliver vocally, none of that mattered. Now, image comes first, and the singing is almost an afterthought. But couldn't someone argue that you're gatekeeping? Andy asked, and the edge was back in his voice. That you're essentially saying only people who fit a certain traditional mold deserve to make music. Dionne's eyes flashed. Gatekeeping. Let me tell you something about gates, Andy. Gates exist to keep standards in place, to ensure quality, to protect the integrity of a craft. I'm not saying people shouldn't make music. Anyone can make music. But when you're asking me to celebrate mediocrity as if it's excellence, when you're telling me I should accept that auto-tuned mumbling is equivalent to what Aretha Franklin did, what Whitney Houston did, what I've spent my entire life doing, then yes, I'm going to stand at that gate. Whitney Houston, Andy repeated, and something shifted in his expression. You were close with Whitney, weren't you? You're actually related. Cousins, I believe. Dionne's entire body went rigid. Don't? I'm just saying you mentioned her name, and I think a lot of people would love to hear. I said don't, Dionne repeated, her voice like steel. Don't you dare use her name as a segue into whatever tabloid conversation you're trying to manufacture. Andy held up his hands defensively. I'm not trying to manufacture anything. You brought her up as an example of vocal excellence, and I agree with you. She was incredible. You were just looking for an opening to ask me about her struggles, her personal life, her death, Dionne finished for him, her words clipped and precise. That's what you people always do. You can't just let greatness stand on its own. You have to pick at the wounds, excavate the pain, turn tragedy into entertainment. That's not fair, Andy protested, his own voice rising now. I interview people about all aspects of their lives. That's what this show is. It doesn't make me uncomfortable, Dionne said, her voice dropping back to that dangerous quiet. It makes me disappointed, because you have an opportunity here to have a real conversation about music, about artistry, about the state of the industry, and instead you keep trying to steer us toward gossip and drama. Is that really all you have to offer? The studio had gone completely silent. Andy's face was flushed now, his jaw clenched. You know what? I think I've been pretty respectful considering what? Dionne interrupted. Considering I'm not playing along, considering I'm not giving you the sound bites you wanted. This is my show, Andy said, his voice tight. I decide what we talk about. And I decide what I answer, Dionne countered. That's how interviews work, when both parties are equals. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe you're not used to interviewing people who see themselves as your equal. Andy's mouth fell open slightly. I cannot believe you just said that. Why? Because it's true, Dionne asked. You talk down to your guests. You ask invasive questions disguised as curiosity. You fish for drama because that's what gets clicks. But some of us remember when interviews were about substance. Andy stood up from behind his desk, a move that clearly surprised everyone. You know what, Miss Warwick? I invited you here to have a conversation, and you've done nothing but attack me in my show since you sat down. Dionne remained seated, completely calm. I accepted your invitation because I thought it would be an opportunity to discuss my work. Instead, you've spent this entire time trying to bait me into fights and dredge up painful memories. I have been nothing but gracious to you. Andy's voice was getting louder. I praised your work. I called you a legend. Words are empty without actions to back them up, Dionne said, finally standing as well. You can call me a legend all you want, but if you treat me like a circus act, the title means nothing. The two of them stood there facing each other across the desk, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing television history or a complete disaster. Andy took a deep breath, visibly trying to regain his composure. Miss Warwick, I think maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't we start over? Let's talk about something positive. Your career spans 6 decades. What moment stands out as the proudest of your life? Dionne studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You think you can just reset the conversation? Pretend the last 20 minutes didn't happen? I'm trying to salvage this interview, Andy said through gritted teeth. I'm trying to give you an opportunity to share something meaningful with the audience. Salvage, Dionne repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. As if this interview is a sinking ship. Let me tell you something, Andy. This interview was doomed the moment you decided to prioritize sensationalism over substance. Andy's face went from flushed to nearly crimson. You have been combative and hostile since the moment you sat down. I have tried, repeatedly, to steer this into productive territory, and you've fought me at every turn. Productive for whom? Dionne shot back. Productive for your ratings. Productive for your viral clips, because it certainly hasn't been productive for me. Having to defend my integrity and my career against your thinly veiled attempts to create controversy, that is not what I'm doing, Andy insisted, his voice rising. I ask tough questions. That's my job. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. The audience gasped audibly. Dionne's eyes went cold, her expression hardening. If I can't handle it, let me tell you what I can handle, Andy. I can handle 6 decades in an industry that tried to tear me down at every turn. I can handle racism, sexism, ageism, and every other ism you can think of. What I cannot and will not handle is disrespect disguised as journalism. The fact that you don't like my questions doesn't make them disrespectful, Andy said, shaking his head. You brought up Whitney's name to exploit her memory for drama, Dionne said, her voice shaking slightly now with barely contained anger. You've repeatedly tried to reduce my accomplishments to relationship gossip. You've questioned whether I'm relevant. And you call that respect? Andy threw his hands up in exasperation. I'm trying to have a real conversation with you. Real conversations include difficult topics. That's what makes for compelling television. Compelling television? Dionne repeated slowly, nodding. There it is. That's what this is really about. Not about honoring my legacy, not about exploring my artistry. It's about creating a moment, a clip, something that will trend tomorrow. That's part of the business, Andy said defensively. You've been in this business long enough to understand how it works. I understand perfectly how it works, Dionne replied. What I don't understand is why you think I should participate in my own diminishment. Why you think I should smile and nod while you try to turn me into a caricature. The studio was so quiet now that you could hear the hum of the cameras. Andy's producer made a motion from off camera, but Andy seemed to have reached his limit. You know what, Miss Warwick? I think you came here looking for a fight. I think you wanted to make me the villain so you could play the victim. Well, congratulations. You've gotten your moment. Dionne's eyebrows rose slowly, a humorless smile crossing her lips. My moment? This isn't about moments or clips or viral videos. This is about principle. This is about drawing a line and saying this far and no further. Your legacy is secure, Andy said, his tone softening slightly. No one is trying to diminish what you've accomplished. Then why not celebrate it? Dionne asked. Why not ask me about the craft? Why not explore how I've maintained my artistry across decades? There are so many substantive questions you could have asked, but you chose not to. Andy was silent for a moment, looking genuinely uncertain. I did ask you about your craft. I asked about Burt Bacharach, about your new music. You asked surface-level questions designed to lead into personal drama, Dionne interrupted. Every question was a setup. Tell me, Andy, what have you learned about my artistry in the last 30 minutes? What insight have you gained into my creative process? Andy opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched out, heavy and damning. That's what I thought, Dionne said softly. You haven't learned anything because you weren't trying to learn. You were trying to provoke. She reached down and unclipped the small microphone from her lapel, the gesture deliberate and final. The audience realized what was happening, a collective intake of breath rippling through the studio. Wait, what are you doing? Andy asked, alarm creeping into his voice. I'm leaving, Dionne said simply, placing the microphone on the arm of the chair. I came here in good faith. That was clearly a mistake. You can't just leave in the middle of an interview, Andy said, his professional facade cracking. We're live. We're on air. I can do whatever I choose to do, Dionne corrected him. And I choose not to participate in this anymore. Andy looked desperately toward his producers, then back at Dionne. Miss Warwick, please, can we just talk about this? Off camera, we can figure this out. There's nothing to figure out, Dionne replied, already moving toward the edge of the stage. You wanted a moment, Andy? You got one, just not the one you were hoping for. Andy's voice took on a pleading quality. This is not how I wanted this to go. I truly admire your work. I truly wanted to have a conversation about your incredible career. Dionne paused at the steps, turning back to look at him. Then you should have acted like it. Admiration without respect is worthless. You can admire someone's work while still treating them poorly, and that's exactly what you did here tonight. Please don't do this, Andy said. Stay. We'll change direction. We'll talk about whatever you want. It's too late for that, Dionne said firmly. You've shown me who you are as an interviewer, and I believe you. I'm not going to give you the opportunity to do more damage. Andy made one last attempt. The viewers, the people watching at home, they tune in to see legends like you. Don't you owe them? Dionne's expression hardened. Don't you dare try to use the audience as leverage. I owe the audience my best work, my authentic self, my truth. And my truth right now is that I will not compromise my dignity for anyone's entertainment. She descended the steps, her posture still perfect, her head held high. Andy stood helplessly behind his desk, realizing there was nothing he could say to stop this. This is unbelievable, Andy said, more to himself than anyone else. Dionne paused once more, looking back. What's unbelievable, Andy, is that you had the opportunity to interview a living legend, someone who shaped American music, and you squandered it. You chose cheap controversy over meaningful conversation. That's what's unbelievable. With that, she continued down the steps, and the studio erupted into confused applause. Andy stood frozen, his eyes wide with the realization of what had just happened. He turned to the camera, his face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. We're going to take an early break, he said, his voice strained. The cameras cut away, and in the chaos that followed, one thing was crystal clear. Dionne Warwick had just reminded everyone watching what dignity looked like, what standing up for yourself looked like, what refusing to compromise your values looked like. She had walked onto that stage as a legend, and she walked off proving exactly why that title was deserved, not just because of her music, but because of her unwavering commitment to being treated with the respect she had earned through decades of excellence. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more content like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, and drop a comment below answering this question in a situation like this. Who do you think handled themselves better, the host or the guest? I want to hear your thoughts.